Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Paul Cardin. His last name is spelled Cardin. He comes to us from the UK. He just published a book, March 2022. Title of the book is Return to Bomb Alley, 1982, The Falklands Deception. And Paul was involved in that event that happened about 40 years and a month ago. So 4 decades ago was when the conflict started. But Paul is now a busy activist and blogger based in the United Kingdom. As a Falklands veteran, he decided it was time to write about his concerns over Margaret Thatcher's 1982 recapture of the islands. And this is the detailed account that's included in this book. He was also, as a UK employee, he was the target of 2 attempts to sack him from his job. He came through victorious both times and retired at age 50 in 2009, securing his pension. He's helping others who've been bullied or intimidated in the workplace, something I can relate to. Also ran a transcription company, which has been trading since 2010. He's married with 2 young daughters and lives in Wallasey, Merseyside, UK, right across from Liverpool. So Paul Cardin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, William.
And so people, maybe most of my audience is in the United States. Can you talk about your background, how you got involved in the military, in sailing, and what led you, or how this process began that led to the Falklands conflict?
Yeah, sure. If I go right back to as a 10-year-old child here in Wallasey, I was born in Wallasey. We used to have a TV program called Blue Peter. Now this was on BBC television, and there was a daredevil on there by the name of John Noakes. And he used to do all these crazy stunts, and he'd take camera crews with him. And I switched Blue Peter on one day, and just in the back room there, and he came on, and he'd taken a camera crew down to a naval training base called HMS Ganges. Now, this was on the east coast of England in Suffolk. And the reason he'd taken the camera crew was because down there, on this shore base, there was a huge sailing mast that they built from two old sailing ships. And this thing was about 140 feet tall. Now, every year, they used to get about 80 trainee sailors, dress them in their uniforms, and then they'd climb to the top of the mast very slowly. I mean, they wouldn't get away with it these days. It'd be so dangerous. But back then, you could do it. And John Noakes started climbing the mast with all these sailors, and I was just, wow, what's going on here, and then I watched them climbing up, and then the bravest of those young boys got right to the very top, and at the top of the mast, if you can picture it, there was a wooden disc about a foot in diameter, and this young sailor clambered up onto the top with John Noakes next to him, and this young lad stood to attention and saluted like that. And I was just amazed, and I thought, wow. And I think that sort of planted the seed for me. And I thought, wow, I think I want to do that. I want to join the Royal Navy. So 6 years later, I did at age 16 and a half, And I made the journey down there to HMS Ganges, and I did my basic training down there. That was in 1976, in February 76. And the reason I joined the Navy is because I didn't fancy joining the army because of what was going on in Northern Ireland at that time. Ironically, I thought I'll stay safe, Right,
interesting. Because all the troubles, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so it also gives you, it's the same thing here in the States. It gives kind of younger men the opportunity to get training and see the world, right? So you traveled through the Mediterranean. Can you talk about all the places you went to? And you kind of kept a diary too, right? And you include that in the book.
I kept a diary when the conflict started, or just before the conflict started. But jumping back, my first ship was HMS Plymouth, and I flew out to Gibraltar to join that in about November 1976. And we did quite a bit of traveling on HMS Plymouth. In 1978, we went over to Canada, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and then we came down the East Coast and we visited New York. Then we went down to Boston, Massachusetts. And for me, this was just all of us. It was great. I mean, we had to work as well. I was a radio operator at the time. So I was very busy in the radio room, working away, but we had time off at the weekends. And when we were in port, we would go travelling, and we'd hire a car and we'd all go off, and we'd have a great time as sailors do, sort of thing, And then we also travelled all around the Mediterranean. So we took in France, Italy, and we took in Malta as well in 1978. And I was really enjoying it. And then fast forward a little bit, and we come to sort of early 1982, and we were off on a Far East deployment. So we were all on a high over that. We were really looking forward to it. We were going out to Singapore and Malaysia and lots of other sort of exotic locations, and we were in Gibraltar, and the news came through that the Falkland Islands had been invaded. And I've got to be honest and say, I didn't know where they were. And I think 99% of our crew, there's about 240 men on our ship, and I'd say the majority of them didn't. Even the ones who had heard of the Falkland Islands probably didn't know where they were, sort of thing. And then we sailed. We sailed off on our deployment, and we were sort of halfway across the Mediterranean, and we were a few days out of Naples. And then I was a leading radio operator by this time. And one night, I think it was about on the 5th of March, I was stood in front of the teleprinter, and a flash message started coming through. And I ripped it off, read it, and it said basically, turn around, go back to Gibraltar, refuel, rearm, take on stores, and then join the HMS Hermes battle group in the South Atlantic, then proceed down to Ascension Island, then proceed to the Falkland Islands. So that was it. I was the first person on our ship to realise that we weren't going on this deployment that we'd all been so keyed up about. And I thought, what should I do with this message?
Right. Gibraltar's at the south of Spain, right? And then Ascension is really just an island in the middle of the Atlantic between South America and Africa, right? And then
that's right. Yeah, and it's around the equator. Yeah.
And Falkland Islands, of South America has something different than North America. Maybe the dispute between the U.S. and Mexico, but there's all kinds of land and border disputes in South America. They fought battles over many of the states and issues of land. I think there's still I think you mentioned in your book, there's a dispute between the very bottom islands just south of Argentina, between Argentina and Chile. So Argentina's always had kind of a claim to the Falklands, right?
Yeah, they have. It began in the early 19th century, I think, when Britain settled down. Britain actually settled in the Falkland Islands. It had been previously owned by Spain. That they had governed it for a while, and then Britain took it over in about 1840. And from that point, and from the point when Argentina got their independence from Spain, that was when the animosity sort of started, and Argentina wanted those islands, and they did approach the UN and the United Nations, and stated that Britain had acted. It was a colonial desire to want those islands, nothing more. But because they were so close to Argentina, they had a better claim over them. But that was proceeding from the 1970s sort of thing. And it didn't really get anywhere because the Falkland Islanders, the British government decided that the Falkland Islanders would have the last say on whether they wanted to be ruled by Argentina. And because they didn't want to be, then that was that was a sort of sticking point, and it never went anywhere.
It's very rural, right? It's not very populated, more sheep than people, and it's in the South Sea. It's kind of cold, and I don't know what the weather's like there, but
the weather is really cold down there. Yeah, sort of, I think June onwards it gets really cold. June, July, August, and then possibly September. September it starts to pick up the heat starts picking up again. But the original invasion was planned for September by Argentina, but it got sort of it was ruined by this scrap metal company that went over to South Georgia and raised an Argentinian flag, and that got back to the UK, and they were sort of alerted by this an Argentinian desire to invade, and they had to bring forward the invasion after that.
Right. So they invaded, and it just it set off kind of a huge response in the UK, right? Can you talk about how Thatcher responded and Thatcher?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Margaret Thatcher as a person too?
Of course, yeah. She was elected in May 1979. And back then, I can even remember it myself. I was sort of 17, 18, something like that. And there was a lot of excitement, I've got to be honest, about the prospect of the first woman prime minister, the first female prime minister in the UK. So a lot of female voters thought, this will make a nice change, With hindsight, they might not be thinking that, but back then they didn't know, and they thought, well, yeah, let's give her a try. And she was voted in, and I think she had about a 30-seat majority. So it's not a huge majority, but she got in, and she was on a high. And then I think the first sort of major incident to occur came in 1980, sort of April, May 1980. And this was a siege in the Iranian embassy in London. Now, about 20 hostages were taken, and Mrs. Thatcher decided to send the SAS in to resolve it. So the SAS were sent in, and they occupied the surrounding buildings, and eventually the order was given to go, and they went in, and they managed to rescue all of the hostages alive, apart from one who'd been killed prior to the order to go. So that was a big success for Mrs. Thatcher, and she was on a high at that point. But the only direction she could go after that was downwards, and she did go down. Basically, it started with her economic policies, which were monetarist. So these were sort of influenced by Milton Friedman and Alan Walters, and they were very unforgiving for working class people. So they started to feel the impact of those economic policies straight away. So we had unemployment, which got to sort of 3 million very quickly. And we had an inflation rate, which was double what it is now in the UK. It was like 18%. So Mrs. Thatcher thought she could fix this by increasing taxes, which is what she did, against the advice of lots of senior economic people. They said, don't do that because the manufacturing base is going to be impacted and industry will be affected. But she just carried on with it. And, there was this phrase, the lady is not for turning, and this lady wasn't for turning, and she wasn't listening to anybody, and she carried on. And before you knew it, we had coal mines closing, we had steel plants closing, and all sorts of manufacturing, because it was basically decimated, by Mrs. Thatcher. And very quickly, between April and July of 1980, we had riots breaking out in all the major cities in the UK. So in London, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Birmingham, there were riots everywhere. And Mrs. Thatcher's, come the end of 1981, Mrs. Thatcher's approval rating was down at 23%, which is actually the lowest approval rating on record for any UK Prime Minister. And by this time, her own people were starting to get very restless. And we had between 30 and 40 MPs who wanted her out. They wanted a new face. And this was enough MPs to make the government fall if she made the wrong move. So she needed something to turn her fortunes around. And I can now go into what was going on behind the scenes.
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So,
because it's interesting in your book, most people would never hear this. I've never heard in the States. She is negotiating earlier, saying the Falklands are not valuable. And this is kind of the decolonization, the end of the decolonization post-World War II movement in Britain,
yeah.
right? So British Honduras, Falklands, all India. So just so many.
Lots of countries that gained their independence, and the British government under Labour and then under the Conservatives wanted to carry that on. But like I said before, the sticking point was the wishes of the islanders. They never wanted to do that. So, but there wasn't much coverage of this in the UK. I can remember this. The press didn't really go near it, so nobody got to know where the Falkland Islands were or what the wishes of the Falkland Islanders were. And Mrs. Thatcher, straight after the invasion, she was saying, the wishes of the Falkland Islanders are paramount. And she kept repeating that. Every time there was a camera placed in front of her, she kept repeating it again and again and again ad nauseum. But she never mentioned it once before the invasion, which is very telling, in my opinion. But if I could just give you the background to what was going on. She'd been involved with General Galtieri and the Junta doing trade deals in 1980, 1981. And the Falkland Islanders didn't know about this and were sort of left out in the cold. And the other thing was she was selling arms to the Junta. Governments always sell arms between each other, but even when this, even with the enmity between the two nations, they were still selling arms, and they were actually selling ships. A couple of Type 42 destroyers got sold in the 1970s to Argentina, which were used in the war. And this arms trading didn't stop until 4 days before the invasion itself. So that's around March the 28th, 29th. That was when the last arms deal was done.
It's amazing.
And another big one was in 1980. Mrs. Thatcher sent a foreign minister by the name of Nicholas Ridley to go and meet Argentina's deputy foreign secretary in Switzerland. This was in Geneva in a place called the Hotel du Lac, a big posh hotel. And it was absolutely top secret. Nobody could breathe a word about this. And what was on the agenda was a 99-year leaseback deal between Britain and Argentina, very similar to what was done between Britain and Hong Kong. If you remember, that expired in 1997, and the governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patton, very reluctantly handed Hong Kong back to China. But this was going to be a similar deal, and under the sort of auspices of this deal, every flagpole in the Falkland Islands would have a Union flag, and beneath it an Argentinian flag. That was the plan. But Mr. Ridley had to go and put this proposal to the Falkland Islanders, who we know were not going to be very receptive to it. And he went down there and he put the proposals to him, and he gave him his chance to speak. But when he finished speaking, they basically gave him the bum's rush and they sent him on his way. They weren't listening. They weren't going to... They didn't like the idea of an Argentinian flag flying on the flag masts in the Falkland Islands. And And
this was only recently publicized, right? So this was under
no,
30-year-old.
that was public at the time, because it did go back to Parliament and MPs threw it out as well. So that was known. But the things that weren't known were the arms deals, the trade deals, and something else that was known was defence cuts. We had these sweeping defence cuts in 1981. And these defence cuts upset the first Sea Lord, who was Admiral Sir Henry Leach, because they impacted the Navy in a very big way. He would have lost two aircraft carriers, one of which was Ark Royal. I can't remember the other one, but he would have lost two of his aircraft carriers. He would have had no aircraft carriers. So he responded to Miss Thatcher and sent her a letter saying, look, I need a Navy that can react at the drop of a hat. It's got to be able to respond if there's an incident somewhere. We've got to go and send our ships and be able to react. But Mrs. Thatcher wasn't listening to him. She wouldn't even give him the time of day. She wouldn't meet him. And then Lord Carrington, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, he said he noticed that HMS Endurance was going to be decommissioned. Now, that ship was the guard ship for the Falkland Islands. So that was a presence there that the Falkland Islanders could look at and think, they do care about us. They've got a ship there to react if anything happens. And Lord Carrington said, not only is it a defensive, not only is it a piece of defence that we've got that ship there, it's also a political statement to say that we care about the wishes of the islanders and we care about protecting them. But she didn't listen to Lord Carrington. And 4 days after the invasion, he resigned, the 6th of April, 1982. So she's just ploughing on like this. And pretty soon, the Argentinians pick up on this and they notice that, it just looks like Mrs. Thatcher doesn't care about these islands at all, and very late on, in about February or March 1982, the British Embassy in Buenos Aires sent a cable to Mrs. Thatcher saying that the press in Argentina were talking about the prospect of the islands coming back to them. So the Argentinian people got to see that something was afoot, and they sort of got the idea that Mrs. Thatcher didn't care about those islands, or Britain didn't care about those islands, and they were probably prepared to see them go,
Right. So they had that thing. It's almost like the same thing happened between Iraq and Kuwait here in the States. There's all kinds of signals. Oh, Kuwait doesn't matter, and it's almost like the same thing happened. I mean, it's all played through.
It was sending very clear signals to Argentina, and I think General Galtieri. It wasn't just this idea that he could have a distraction from his economic failure, He was a military. He probably thought, I could invade there and it's not going to be contested. They're not going to react, and I'll be able to walk away with those islands, and my people will love it, But that didn't happen, as we know.
Right. I mean, so they were thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be a cakewalk and walk in the park. So you're being sent. You come out of Gibraltar, Ascension, going south, and I mean, the conflict got pretty intense, didn't it? I mean, there were a lot. You say 907 people died, right?
Well, there were 900 plus died. Yes, there were 255 British and 700 plus Argentinians died, and 3 civilians. Which it sounds very small these days after what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but 3 civilians died through friendly fire, actually. But to pick up from the sort of start as we were sailing south, there were peace proposals being made, and Alexander Haig, the Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, he was the go-between between the two nations, and peace proposals were coming and going. We were seeing them. I was seeing them because I was in charge of the Starboard Watch radio team. So that was me and 6 guys. We would have BBC World Service on, and to be honest, we used to get more information coming out of the radio, the World Service, than we did from the equipment that was around us. Sometimes. But we'd be monitoring these peace proposals and watching them come and go. And to be honest, both governments were using them as a means to sort of pretend they were listening, but sort of arming at the same time. All that was going on. And there was one very important peace proposal that came to fruition at the end of April. So this was just before the Belgrano was sunk. And it was a Peruvian peace proposal. It came from President Belaunde in Peru. And he called Charles Wallace to his office. That was the UK ambassador. He had a 7-point peace plan, which he gave to Charles Wallace, and Charles Wallace sent it by telegram to the UK, to London, on the 1st of May. Now, on the 2nd of May, the Belgrano was sunk, and Mrs. Thatcher was later challenged on TV on a program called Nationwide by a lady called Diana Gould, who asked Mrs. Thatcher, why did you not respond to the telegram that had been sent the day before? And Mrs. Thatcher responded by saying she hadn't received the telegram until after the attack. And then people sort of in the know worked out that she hadn't received the telegram for 17 hours. Now, we know telegrams take seconds to arrive. And I knew that as a radio operator. So I've never seen an acceptable reason for the delay. She must have known about that peace proposal, but she didn't publicly react to it or respond. And then the next thing you know, the Belgrano is being sunk with the loss of 300 plus lives.
And that's controversial too, because
the
UK put in an exclusion zone. Nobody comes inside of this zone, and the Belgrano was outside of that, right?
Yeah, that's right. She was outside, and she'd actually been sailing away from the task force, away from the Falkland Islands, and on a westerly course for 14 hours. Okay, she could change course at any moment and start going the other way and start going back towards the task force, but she'd never done that, and she was torpedoed by the Conqueror, HMS Conqueror, and sunk. But there's another story around this as well, which is Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward was the guy in charge of Operation Corporate, which was all of the UK ships down in the South Atlantic. And he answered to a guy called Admiral Fieldhouse, who was based in Northwood in London. So Admiral Fieldhouse was in overall charge, but Rear Admiral Woodward was in charge of the ships and the planes. Now, Rear Admiral Woodward, 10 years after the Falklands, eventually published a book called 100 Days. And inside that book, he told us about a pincer movement that was developing at the time, so on the 1st of May. Now, the pincer, if you can imagine, where's my hands? Sorry, where are we? Everything's opposite, but there's the pincer. Right. The sort of northern claw of the pincer was an Argentinian aircraft carrier called the Vicentento de Mayo, or the 25 de Mayo. That's the northern claw. That was about 150 to 200 miles away from the task force. The southern claw of the pincer was the Belgrano. That was 350 miles away from the task force on the 2nd of May. Now, I need to talk about the armaments of each vessel. So the southern ship, the Belgrano, had 15 6-inch guns. And the Belgrano had been built in the Second World War. It was a former US vessel, USS Phoenix. It was there at Pearl Harbor, and it survived that. But it was later sold to Argentina and became the ARA Belgrano. 15 6-inch guns, 10 5-inch guns. So it really packed a punch. Back in the Second World War, during those sea battles used to have, it could have knocked hell out of any ship that came within range of those guns. Now, it was 350 miles away, and the range of its guns was 14 miles. So it needed to reduce that distance by 336 miles to become a clear and present threat to us. Okay.
So it's not even
Now,
close. It wasn't
it's not
close
close
to
at all, and it was sailing away as well when it was sunk. Now, the aircraft carrier, on the 1st of May, that was, like I say, 150 to 200 miles away from us, or the task force. It had 6 Skyhawk bombers planes on it. Now, they had a battle radius of 700 miles, so they could fly 350 miles, drop their bombs, and come back 350 miles and land safely on the aircraft carrier. But, now this is a very big but, on the 1st of May, if I left the radio room and went up top and had a look and scanned the horizon, it was absolutely flat. It was like a big blue billiard table. Absolutely like that. Now, the problem with that is any aircraft carrier needs to be sailing into a headwind of force 3, 4, or 5 or higher in order to give its planes the uplift under the wings. Now, you've got to remember that these planes are heavily laden. Each Skyhawk has got 4 500-pound bombs, so each plane has got an extra 2,000 pound of weight on it. Now, the captain didn't even give any orders to those planes to take off when they were within range, and there was a very good reason. They would have gone up the ramp and just into the sea. There's no way they could have got into the air in those conditions. So I think when Admiral Woodward eventually told us about this threat 10 years later, which I've got questions about that anyway, but when he eventually told us about this threat, I think he'd either made a mistake or was telling fibs, because he's obviously a very clever man and he knows the capability of his enemy. And he would have known that those planes could not have taken off on that day. Whereas his planes could have taken off because he had vertical takeoff and landing Sea Harriers, so he could have sent his planes off, but the Argentinians couldn't have on that day.
Right. So there's a lot of sketchy things that happen in that conflict. And why did you call the can you reference why you called the title of your book Return to Bomb Alley?
Because Bomb Alley was the nickname for San Carlos water. And my ship HMS Yarmouth spent 2 weeks in Bomb Alley. So we spent 2 weeks being bombed by Skyhawks and Mirages and Daggers, all the Argentinian planes that came over, that were coming over for a 2-week period. So that became known as Bomb Alley. That's why.
And there was a lot of bombs being dropped on ships. And the conflict was really something. It was kind of like a modern conflict exercise. And you even mentioned the possibility that the UK moved nukes into place, right? Or into the area.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a possibility. They did do that.
They did do it.
There were 31 nuclear depth charges carried by our vessels. That it only became known in January of this year. So just less than 40 years it took for that information to come out. I mean, the Ministry of Defence and the government were being questioned about that, but their position was always not to say anything. So they basically said, we can't comment. That's all they ever said. But we eventually found out that these nuclear depth charges were being carried. And I did hear them being talked about. They weren't referred to as nuclear weapons, though. I only heard about them being referred to as the 1,000-pound bomb. So and I thought, my sort of ears went up and I thought, why are they talking about the 1,000-pound bomb? And eventually it became clear that it must have been these nuclear depth charges. And we still don't know to this day whether any ships carrying the 1,000-pound bomb were sunk, whether HMS Sheffield had any on or whether HMS Antelope had any on. We really, or Coventry, we still don't know.
Right. Yeah, and there was a treaty, the Telco Treaty, no nukes in the area. So that
That's
was it.
right. We were a signatory to that, so we were breaching that treaty.
Right. And also I wasn't the head, wasn't Galtieri involved in Operation Condor too? So like
He
there was
was.
all okay. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, back in the 70s, Kissinger and Nixon got their heads together and decided that they would have a drive to remove what they called the communist influence in South America. And this was Operation Condor, and lots of countries, Brazil, Argentina, and lots of others. In Argentina, it was known as the Dirty War, and basically they would knock on the door of suspected communists in the middle of the night, drag them off to be tortured and killed and probably buried in shallow graves. This is back in the 1970s and in the early 80s. And it went on for quite a few years, and tens of thousands of people were killed. And I mean, Henry Kissinger is still on the loose now. I spotted him the other day at Davos, so people are still giving him a lot of respect when he should be behind bars, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean the overthrow of Allende in Chile too
Yeah,
was part of that whole thing. That was the first 9/11. That was in the
that's
early
right.
70s. Yeah. So
Yeah,
Galtieri was part of that whole thing, and
yeah.
the Thatcher, like you state in your book, she benefited from the victory, right? Like she played it for domestic benefit.
She
Right?
did. She did, because she'd managed to hide all the hidden things had been hidden for the next 30 years. So they didn't come out until 2012. And even then, I was talking earlier about telegrams. I noticed while I was researching the book that all incoming telegrams from the South American continent have been embargoed until the year 2052. So they basically banged another 40 years on top of that. Now, I think that telegram I was talking about that was sent that had a 17-hour delay, I think that's going to be one of them, because that will have timestamps on it for when it was sent and when it was received, and that will give everything away. So I think what they're doing there is they're protecting Mrs. Thatcher's legacy, which came in for a bit of a battering, as you'll know, when it was discovered that she was meeting a person called Jimmy Savile. She was inviting him to Chequers. Now, Chequers, for your viewers, is the country home of the UK Prime Minister since 1921. So Mrs. Thatcher was meeting Jimmy Savile, and she met him 11 times. And I've worked out that she must have met him in 1979, right through until 1990. All those 11 New Years, she was meeting this fella, and he was a paedophile. He was a child rapist and a necrophiliac. And she didn't just have Savile as one of her close friends. She had Chile's General Pinochet as a very close friend as well.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And she never criticized Pinochet for his involvement in Operation Condor. He was disappearing tens of thousands of his own citizens, along with Galtieri, and Mrs. Thatcher never ever criticised these people. She just said nothing about it.
They were really brutal. Pinochet was incredibly brutal in that takeover,
Yeah.
the September 11th takeover. I think it was 72.
Mm.
But yeah, so I mean, this is all taking place in that environment. Galtieri, probably propped up by the CIA, the U.S., and he's destroyed by this conflict, right? This is pretty much the nail in the coffin for him, right?
It was. He was only the country's leader for a year, between 1981 and 1982, and eventually he ended up in prison, and I think died shortly after. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So and Thatcher came out great, and was the Falklands to this day are still UK property, correct?
That's right, yeah, and along with Ascension Island, which is UK property. Ascension Island has got a huge airstrip on it, and we could never have pulled off this victory without Ascension Island, and that's how it remains now. The population back in 1982 of the Falkland Islands was just 1,800 people. And even back then, I was only 22, and I was thinking, why are we sending 30,000 sailors, soldiers, and airmen to rescue 1,800 people who we'd never heard about? You know, it didn't really make sense to me. And then later on, when I'm researching the book, I'm discovering things like Mrs. Thatcher's husband, Dennis, was actually a director of the Falkland Islands Company. And that was an undeclared interest, which never came out until way after, the victory and the return of the Conservative government. And I think I sent some information to you, which talked about 90% of the Falkland Islands land, including all the sheep farms, was actually owned by absentee landlords who were based in the UK. So when Mrs. Thatcher was going on about, the interests of the Falkland Islanders is paramount, she didn't mention these landlords who actually owned the land. And it was obviously their interests that were paramount, but she never told us about that. And the BBC and the media never told us about that either, you know.
All right, so that's all left out, conveniently left out. Kindness as asking you a question. Paul, what would you say was the biggest deception at play?
The biggest deception of them all was the behaviour of Mrs. Thatcher and her ministers behind the veil, you know, which wasn't revealed to the public and still hasn't been revealed to this day. We got a certain amount of information in 2012, but I think she basically tempted General Galtieri into a trap and he fell for it. That was the biggest deception of the lot, because her behaviour changed completely after he'd fallen into that trap.
Right. So it's just like Saddam Hussein and here in the States and the invasion of Kuwait and all the propaganda surrounding that and all that stuff, and all the ministers. And very complex. Really great discussion.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add or anything I missed? We're about 40 minutes.
Well, there's so much to go into, really. I mean, let me just jog my memory.
Well, have people, let's get them to go get the book, because you have it all in that book. You have all of your notes, your diaries included in that. You have a first-person account of the conflict, so it's all there. I would definitely recommend people check that out.
It's all there. One other issue I go into is back in the 70s, I think in about 77 or 78, one of the multinational oil companies did some prospecting in that area. They didn't come back with anything positive about oil, but some of the geology seemed to indicate that there may be oil there. And since then, we've discovered that there is. But I think that may have swayed Mrs. Thatcher as well in her decision to send 30,000 men to rescue 1,800 people. The possibility that there may have been oil there. Plus, there were the strategic influences. You know, we don't explore Antarctica, which for those who don't know, there's a landmass beneath the ice in Antarctica. And in that landmass, there probably is going to be oil and minerals, and it's all beneath the ice and it's beyond reach. But in the future, it could be somewhere that countries will explore. And I think Mrs. Thatcher will have had that in mind when she decided to send the task force down there.
Right. And so the best place to get the book is on Amazon. Is that correct? There's a Kindle version and a paperback version, right?
That's right, on Amazon. But if you just go to any web browser and type in the name of the book, Return to Bomb Alley, The Falklands Deception, or type my name in, your screen will fill with, there's about 32 different places, including Amazon, where you can get this book. Yeah. It's only 168 pages, so it isn't the biggest read. You could probably read it in an hour and a half, but I've packed a lot of information into it.
Right. First person, you were there 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And for people who want to reach out to you to continue the discussion, do you have any social media or an email I can put in the show notes?
Yeah. I do run a blog, and it's called wirralinittogether.blog. That's a WordPress blog, and that's been running for about the last 8 years. So anybody can contact me on that. If you send your email to that, you will get my information. And
Great.
I don't really want to give my email address out here.
Don't do it. But the WordPress is perfect. So we're all in it together is all one word. Correct?
No, it's called Wirral. Wirral.
Wirral.
That's where I live. Wirral. That's
Wirral.
WIRRAL. Wirral. In it together.
Gotcha.
.blog. All one word.
Great. Perfect.
Yeah.
And again, the title of the book is Return to Bomb Alley, 1982, The Falklands Deception, and the author is Paul Cardin. So, Paul, thanks so much for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, William.
Take care.
Cheers.
Stay there.